going to be talking about a strategic approach to skills development for just energy transition and, well, the energy crisis. I think I just want to mention that this is more from the perspective of the just energy transition. And I think a lot of people think about the just energy transition as just being a coal to renewables transition, but it's actually so much more than that. And I think once we realize that, we can actually start planning better as we go on. In terms of the landscape or the ecosystem for just transition or just energy transition, I think there are various aspects that need to be considered, and these are some of the representations of those different aspects. So obviously you need to understand what technical pathways you're going to adopt in terms of technology and what makes sense from a feasibility and modeling perspective. You also need to understand from the modeling in terms of the environmental considerations that need to be taken account, and then the social considerations of socio-economic impacts of those in terms of what is going to be removed from the economy versus what is going to be planned in terms of the new developments. And that speaks to the next point of economic diversification and the other economic considerations. And I think here there's a lot of understanding in terms of the coal to renewables, but in terms of the jobs that would actually be lost from the coal sector, I think renewables will never be able to replenish the number of jobs that would be lost. And I think that we need to come to that realization, and from that realization, understand what needs to be done. And this is where economic diversification is required in terms of different sectors, in terms of unpacking what the different linkages are and where there could be opportunities like manufacturing, circular economy, agriculture, and linking that up to energy. There's a lot of opportunities there. And obviously, all of this needs to be encapsulated in enabling policy and enabling infrastructure, which looks at an ecosystem approach and understanding it at a holistic level. And at the basis is obviously innovation that we try to actually stimulate within this process, and hope that we will actually achieve it for, or we actually do need to achieve it for the just transition. In terms of the targets, I think as the starting point, if we look at it and say, okay, what do we actually want to solve for? Yes, the decarbonization part is what's being pushed, and as per the last presentation, you saw that is almost something that is being enforced from the top. But I think from that perspective, we need to say, okay, with this transition, what can we actually get out, and what do we need to actually fight for in terms of, trying to actually help our economic growth and other financial issues that we have as a country. So we look at the triple challenge that we're facing, which is unemployment, poverty, and inequality. We have the highest unemployment rate in the world, and we are the most unequal country in the world. And I think that definitely needs to be changed. And the transition itself and the just element actually enables us to look at opportunities for us to actually change this. So those are the targets that we would say, okay, we would have poverty alleviation as one of the major impacts, job creation and economic development, and equality and balanced equality in terms of income, as well as from a female and male perspective as well. And then I think in realization of decarbonization and diversifying our economies, I think at the end, we are also trying to help or trying to achieve this challenge of reducing the financial risks that we actually have for investment in the country. And all of this goes actually hand in hand. So if we, increase or have economic growth, we can actually, target how to reduce our financial risks in that perspective. At the basis, we also need to ensure that we align to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this, there's a lot of opportunity to actually link up the different Sustainable Development Goals to what we're trying to do within the transition. So with that in mind, what is the actual strategic approach that I'm putting forward? So I've kind of mapped out this in different steps. And I think, a lot of people think skills development, okay, TVETs and course or curriculum development from a university, but I think it's much more than that, and that's where we need to be able to open our thoughts up in terms of accepting what actually needs to go within these different elements of skill development, and what can we actually do to actually successfully achieve skills development for the transition and going forward as well. So firstly, understanding the current system. So what is firstly the status quo in terms of the current skills landscape, in terms of what do we have and what we'll be working with. Also, what is the current landscape in terms of electricity, and looking at the crisis in terms of what we have had or are going through in terms of that, but including energy. And this, again, to the previous presentation, we need to try and open up our views in terms of looking at energy and not necessarily electricity. I think electricity is a very big part of that, but I think at the end of the day, energy is quite a broad element that we need to actually figure out in terms of how we incorporate this in our plans. If you look at our greenhouse gas emissions, I think at a global level, and it's very similar to South Africa, only 46% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from electricity. But in terms of energy as a whole, it's almost 80%. So you can just see that gap in terms of electricity versus energy and how we're actually looking at it. But we also need to consider the value chain. So the coal mining value chain is so critical in terms of electricity. So when we look at, for example, decommissioning, you must understand that there's a link to coal mining, and there's a link to the coal value chain that has induced indirect and direct jobs that have been created from that value chain. And this is what we need to ensure that we're actually solving for when we are planning and going forward. We also then, step 2 goes to how to get to what is actually required. And this is, I think, in some way, this is the crystal ball that we actually need to look into and try and predict the future in a way. Obviously, all our predictions will not necessarily come true, but I think if you put in scientific modeling and based on proper assumptions and inputs, I think you can get to something that is very close to what can be achieved. So this needs to look at holistic modeling. And when I say holistic, I mean it needs to look at the social, the socioeconomic, the technical, and financial aspects. And not only from a technical perspective needs to be holistic, but also within that, it needs to incorporate. So if we, for example, look at a pathway for technology, and we would say that, okay, there would be solar and there would be wind, et cetera, et cetera. But from that, how do we actually co-optimize in terms of getting the best socioeconomic benefit in terms of job creation, GDP output, as well as the most feasible and optimizing performance within that as well. So it's that holistic approach that needs to be had. And this incorporates theory of change. It incorporates systems thinking to actually understand what the ecosystem needs to look like. And then within electricity itself, you need to have co-optimization of generation, transmission, and distribution. I think currently we look at the IRP that specifically speaks to generation. There's one modeling tool that looks at that, and it looks at statistics mostly in terms of performance data and trying to balance out what performance characteristics we're trying to get out to look at financial feasibility as well of those technologies, and other aspects are considered. But it's looking at a system from a demand and supply perspective. Now, when we move down, transmission would come in and they would say, okay, let's develop the transmission development plan based on what has been developed in the IRP. And there you can even see when they go into the detailed modeling, there has been some aspects that are discrepancies. So that is why we are in the issue of the grid capacity in the Northern Cape and other areas, because that co-optimization exercise was not included. And then further to that, you now look at the distribution, and they have national development plans for their different networks and different areas. That needs to be co-optimized with the transmission plan. And this needs to be sequenced in a proper way. So I think that is what's also missing in terms of us trying to sequence what needs to happen when and how that would actually occur. So from that perspective, you would obviously get, for example, the decommissioning schedule from the plan. and that would incorporate the environmental aspect. Apologies, when I said holistic modeling, I'm also supposed to include the environmental aspect. And once we have that picture, we can then say what is the current plan in terms of decommissioning to reach our goals, but then what is the impact for that in terms of the value chains that are already existent? So how many jobs are we going to lose in a specific area? How is that going to affect the economy? How is that going to affect a specific area in terms of the skills that is then needed for us to actually move forward? Or can we actually use those skills and repurpose or reskill, upskill, and move forward in that way? And this is where the linkages come in with economic diversification. So if there is, in Mpumalanga, for example, we have about over 11 gigs that from the 2019 IRP, over 11 gigs of coal-fired power stations that need to be decommissioned by 2030. But in terms of the replacing or replenishing that electricity supply, we have renewable generation, but there's not one solar or wind farm in Mpumalanga up to date. And we've had REAP for over 11 years from 2011. So that is kind of the discrepancies that you kind of see. And you need to solve for that because now the economies are shrinking within those areas and it's not a just transition anymore. And this is where we look at repurposing, we look at economic diversification. So if the renewables resource, and it's actually not that bad in Mpumalanga, but if it isn't that competitive with Northern Cape or the other Cape provinces, then we look at other aspects like agricultural activity and moving forward in terms of diversifying the economy. How can we actually ensure that those different subsectors can create or replenish the jobs that would be lost and also sustain the economy going forward? Because again, we need to identify solutions that is sustainable. We can't be identifying solutions that would just solve a problem now, and then next 5 years we're like, what have we done? So I think that is also needs to be understood in terms of determining what is required. So once you've had that crystal ball, I know make it seem very easy, but in that, you would then identify what type of technology pathways you will have and how you're moving forward in different subsectors. And there you would be able to identify what the skills for those different pathways going forward would be, but also what the gaps would then be. So from there, it needs to be a value chain perspective. It needs to look at the whole ecosystem. You need to be able to say in a specific field, for example, solar PV, are we considering manufacturing? If we are saying we're going to install a manufacturing plant in Mpumalanga, and that is going to create so many jobs in Mpumalanga. But from the skills status quo, do we have enough of the skills to actually create that? Or is that even a decision in terms of, or decision-making component in terms of, do we actually go for Mpumalanga versus another area? So these are the aspects that needs to be considered in this value chain approach. And then you can also have an understanding of what soft and hard skills are required. And here, when we speak about the soft skills, even strategy development, even financial feasibilities, those are skills that needs to be developed, and that needs to be incorporated within these value chain approaches. For example, in wind farm development, recently I've learned about how important birds are actually important in terms of development of the farm itself and the environmental authorizations that you can actually get. And there's a significant understanding that's actually required in terms of data collection and understanding of bird patterns. And I'm just making an example, but this is the level of detail that we need to be getting to actually identify what skills gaps we have. And in terms of that, then we would be able to look at what value chains we are creating, and then move on to the actual interventions that would then be required. And this would look at how do we then develop the new skills that would be required, but it also looks at the entire education system. I think at the end of the day, when we look at the jobs that we can actually achieve or possibly achieve from some of the studies that are existent, we see that most of the good paying or high paying and good working condition jobs come from STEM related skills that have been developed or professions. And if we're not funding skills development in STEM as much as we should, we as South Africans are not going to benefit from these developments that are going to be coming to the country. There is investment in the country, but we're probably going to import the skill. And that is something that we should try as much as possible to avoid. And try to actually look at how do we actually go in, and this is a long term. It's not a short term, low-hanging fruit that you could say, let's just do it now. It's actually a long-term vision that needs to be built over time and needs to be enforced. And this can, even look at how do we change how we do skills development for maths and science in school and actually attract more students to those subjects and change the system in that way so that we can actually get the jobs that we are actually saying that we're going to be getting in terms of the modeling that we are doing. So that's the skills development interventions. And then obviously there's governance funding and how you're actually going to implement these skills development programs and the support that would be required. So this speaks to, the regulation requirements, the funding partners, who are the key role players and how do they need to be incorporated in this plan and development of such. And lastly, I think we need to get to a more monitoring and evaluation and continuous improvement in terms of, getting to a culture of creating continuous learning, flexibility, adaptability to change, being resilient. And here you can actually look at developing cross-cutting skills that would be easily moved to another profession or another technology development value chain. And I think that's where we need to get to. But if we don't know what indicators we are actually monitoring or making progress on, then we would never know how to actually improve in terms of the process and get to a point where we are actually more resilient. So in terms of some of the considerations, I think I just want to go quickly in terms of this. I know that I have taken quite a lot of time and you will get the slides. So this is some of the questions that can be asked in terms of how do we plan for skill development and actually moving towards strategy development in relation to that. I think obviously I've touched on many of these points in the previous slide. So the status quo is most important. How do you look at the different ecosystem changes that would be required, and then the enabling environment and the actual actions. So I think I'm just going to go forward. So some of the technology avenues for decarbonization. So I think this is from IRENA in terms of the world outlook. You can see that energy efficiency, and it was mentioned in the previous slide, energy efficiency is so critical for us to actually get to our decarbonization targets and possibly assist with the energy crisis matters as well. And you can see that 25% of our emissions are going to be reduced by renewables, but the same percentage is actually energy efficiency as well. And I'll take you through a little bit of what energy efficiency measures need to be considered. But I think this is so critical. Electrification of the transport sector and other sectors is also another critical part. Then there's hydrogen, and that's a small component, and carbon capture, etc. But at COP last year, this was a discussion that was had, and it was said that we need to actually triple the renewable power that we have globally by 2030 and double all of the energy efficiency measures that we have currently by 2030 as well, to actually ensure that we may reach our net zero target by 2050. And then in terms of the future energy system, I think this gives you a little bit of a glimpse from a generation perspective or a supply and demand perspective. Obviously, we need to consider energy mix, and I think here, there's a lot of considerations in terms of what technologies make sense and where. This is by no means a modeling exercise that has been done. It's just a representation of some of the technologies that needs to be considered. And you can even see the incorporation of green hydrogen and the other sectors, and the incorporation of heat into some of the sectors as well that needs to be taken into account in terms of our decarbonization strategies. In terms of future electricity system, I think we've already reached that point in South Africa. I think there's just an element of the unbundling that needs to be taken hold and or taking place. And here, we speak about the creation of the distribution system operator, the market operator, and the creation of aggregators and the creation of different markets. And here there's a lot of opportunities within the distribution sector that needs to be considered. But in that itself, there's a lot of value chains that would be created. And again, link it up back to skills. How do we actually ensure that we are creating the right skills to create this market in South Africa, to ensure that, when the market is actually ready, we somewhat have a stepping stone to that, and not looking at each other and scratching our heads in terms of how do we actually do this. And in terms of that, there's a lot of hardware that's needed. There's a lot of software that's needed. We're moving a lot towards 4IR and automation of a lot of processes. So in that, this speaks to the whole electricity system and other sectors. But there's a lot of opportunity within that to consider how to actually optimize different systems and how to incorporate that in your new skills development that would be required. For example, we speak about the grid and the developments that's required for us to actually install the capacity that we want within the integrated resource plan. And I think we need to, triple the capacity that we are building in terms of Eskom building the transmission network from that backbone of the Northern Cape down to the other Cape. And in that, the skills, do we actually even have the skills to design network at that rate, at that level, and the incorporation of new technology? And I think there's actually a lot that needs to be done in that space. We speak about the rate at which we need to do it and the pace at which we need to do it, especially from the energy crisis perspective. But I think we definitely need to consider that the skills and the lack of skills can actually make or break how South Africa actually benefits from whatever we're doing in the transition, be it even for the energy crisis. So I think there's a lot that's required. Electric vehicles, we know that we are moving towards new energy vehicles. 90% of BMW's manufactured vehicles is actually being exported. And that's going to actually need to change to electric vehicles because of the carbon border adjustment mechanism and some of the other carbon tax issues that are coming out. And do we have that ecosystem, and are we creating it, and are we actually focusing enough on it? And we then also look at domestic production versus export. Are we even creating a market for that? That I think needs to be incorporated in the thinking. Speaking about the grid, I think this gives you a very good picture in terms of how important the grid is actually to reaching our net zero target. So this is from the IEA, and you can look at the difference in terms of the grid delay case versus the planned pledges that we actually have from a global perspective, and look at the big gap in terms of where we get to at 2030. And I think it's such a big eye opener for us that we actually need to get to developing as soon as possible, so that we ensure that at some stage we are on path to actually reaching the goals. And we can speak about the net zero goals and why that's so important. I think in South Africa specifically, or Africa, we are actually twice affected in terms of the global north, and you can see the impacts of climate change already. So to some extent, it's a global problem, yes, but I think we have our say and our input in terms of how we actually can solve it ourselves and ensure that we are planning properly in terms of how we want to develop it going into the future. Considerations for energy storage. A lot of people think that energy storage is battery storage, and that's specifically speaking to the picture of electrochemical in this picture. But there's a lot of other energy storage technologies that can actually be considered. And where does it make sense? When does it make sense? That is where the holistic modeling needs to come in play. And in terms of the different technologies, you can see the mechanical, there's thermal, there's chemical, and this gives you a little bit of a picture of how Australia is thinking for end use and some of the different energy storage that fits into some of the end use capability or the requirements from there. But I think we need to also incorporate this in our thinking in terms of, okay, it's not only battery technology to for energy storage. And I think there's also another element behind the battery technologies as well, in terms of resources and how we actually getting the lithium, and is there enough lithium for or whatever other electrochemical technologies there are. Is there enough material in the world, critical minerals, for us to actually reach net zero as a globe? And I think that discussion of beneficiation needs to be had. We have some of the lithium ion materials. We also have some vanadium materials globally. And I think that's another discussion in terms of manufacturing and how do we incorporate that within our pathways. But you can see the need for holistic modeling. You can see the need for everyone to talk to each other to actually understand how do we look at this and solve this picture together. This is the picture for energy storage, energy efficiency. And you can see here, a lot of people think energy efficiency is just changing your CFL in terms of your light bulbs. But there's so much more, and that incorporates, the transport, the how we also electrify transport, how we use distributed energy resources, but also in our networks itself. Is energy efficiency in terms of how the transformers, or improvement in terms of how we incorporate it in transformers, incorporate it in the materials that are used in networks. And this again speaks to that holistic understanding in terms of development of grid and incorporation of the different aspects within the development of that. So I think this just gives you a bit of a picture of some of the aspects that need to be considered. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list, but I think it gives you another eye opener in terms of, there's so much more that we can actually do within energy efficiency itself. This is speaking to the social element of social welfare. And this comes from a report done by IRENA for South Africa. This is actually South African numbers, where they looked at the planned energy scenarios, which means the different regulations that and governance that was in place at this specific point. And I think this was in 2023. 2023. And then they looked at what the 1.5 degree Celsius target should be in terms of our net zero emissions. And you can see the difference in terms of the jobs that would be created between the different scenarios. And they also did a social welfare index in terms of looking at the difference of the jobs created in the 1.5 degrees Celsius target versus our planned energy target. And there's actually a 98% improvement in the social welfare. Yes, I understand there's needs to question how they got to that number, but I think this just gives you an indication of some of the considerations that needs to be done within the different modeling activities that we actually need to look at holistically for decarbonization and economic diversification as a whole. And this also gives you a picture of what is actually considered in the different social welfare elements of the index itself. But you will have the slides and you will be able to maybe go through that in more detail. But in conclusion, I think what I want to say is collaboration and alignment from all government entities is actually key. And this again was said in the previous presentation. I think we need alignment between DMRE, GTIC, presidency, and the like, DPE, whoever is actually incorporated. Actually, all the government entities are incorporated in this vision. From there, we need to be able to create a common vision. So what are we trying to solve for as a country, and how do we then use that to actually incorporate in terms of our different activities that need to follow. Obviously, I know I'm sounding like let's sing Kumbaya and it's a euphoria, but I think it's something that we need to work towards as a country to actually have successful development in the country. And I think the other aspects that I just want to mention, the modeling and the strategy needs to be cross-sectorial, and it needs to involve the technical, socioeconomic, environmental, governance, and also the financial players. There needs to be the theory of change, which enables the systems thinking to actually solve for these issues. And there needs to be immediate activities needed for the energy crisis. But I think in that can be incorporated within the bigger plan. I think there are some opportunities where you would actually kill two birds with one stone. And I think those are the quick wins that we can actually, try to drive for. And one of that is, the grid development that's required, and some of the other modeling exercises that can be looking at in terms of the curtailment and can we actually, increase the different power plants outputs, etc. And again, that also then speaks to soft skills, the legal aspects. Those are the skills that we need to incorporate and develop so that we ensure that we don't reach issues such as those that have been mentioned before. And then other aspects and technologies that are complementary and conform to the just element of the transition needs to be considered. For example, circular economy and the water, energy, food nexus, social ownership, and this speaks to the three justices in the just transition framework, most specifically the restorative justice and distributive justice that we try to incorporate within the transition. I think at this point, people are just doing whatever they can, and they're just putting something down to say that we are doing something, but that's not necessarily the right way that we should be approaching it. But I understand there's some pressures, there's some time pressures to actually do something. I think we just need to meet in the middle, but obviously in the same process, a plan for the future and actually have proper plans in place. Finance and funding needs to actually be redesigned. We need to incorporate blended finance. We need to be able to understand how to look at finance in a different way, even de-risking mechanisms for us to actually incorporate within the financing of infrastructure, for example, and some of the other elements within the African context as a whole. And here, again, it also speaks to partnerships that can be forged. Here you can incorporate, public-private partnerships, and we are looking at that for the transmission development. And I think that is a very good step in the right direction. I think we just need to ensure that we incorporate it in a holistic manner and understand the repercussions of such and how it would actually play out in terms of the model. Like, are we using a build, own, operate and transfer model, or who has the mandate and responsibilities? I think those are some the key elements that needs to be considered. And lastly, capacity building for decision makers and key role players are actually so significant in this, because at the end of the day, you would rely on the local municipality to have in their integrated development plan, your project, your solar wind project, for example. And if they don't understand how to incorporate that in the plan, when you go to them for permits, they would sit and look at you and say, I don't know how to do this. And then that causes so much challenges, so much delays. And it's just, basically take everyone along on the journey. It's no point us, discussing this at a national level, but then at a local level, people don't understand what is happening on the ground, and they're actually the ones that are responsible for implementation. So I think this is where we also need to basically take people along on the journey and ensure that we're taking the right people along as well. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.